What's going on, y'all? I'm KMBest. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Incredibly, there is only one place to start. The most played deck in the top 10% of High Infinite, one of the breakout stars of this OTA, Agatha Harkness. Now, for those who have not kept up with the nitty-gritty, the day-to-day of Marvel Snap, this will undoubtedly come as a shock. Agatha Harkness is a card that has been synonymous with memes, with jokes, with gags. It has not ever been in a good deck until now. This is the Agatha list cooked up by Husky Puppies with one important change. Instead of the worst performing 5-drop Vision, we now have Makari in the deck. The upside of Makari is the only thing this deck really cares about is points output, and Makari is a card that is able to freely enter the board basically wherever. Minimal downsides include additional possibilities of randomly losing you the game on locations like Space Throne, but you even have Claw a lot of the time that can make up for that deficiency. Makari providing free points is something this deck desperately needs. One of the major downsides this deck has had is that after you have evaluated your situation, vomited your Agatha points out on turn 4, played your power turn 5, you often have cards sitting in your hand that you're just like, oh, I'm never going to get to play those this game. Makari sort of solves that problem. Now, as far as this deck plays, it actually has one of the simplest play patterns in the entire game. You play whatever you have on turn 1, Agatha plays whatever you have on turn 2. On turn 3, you play one of your 3 enablers for making a turn 4 Agatha. Those are, in order of general power, Moon Knight when you don't have Ghost Rider, but you do have the Ebony Blade, or the ability to get an Ebony Blade off the Black Knight. Then you have Lady Sif when you do have Ghost Rider, and then you have Wave when you have a Ghost Rider in your hand, no Lady Sif, and you want to make sure you get that Agatha onto the board. You don't want to risk a Moon Knight play. Of course, the best thing this deck can do a lot of the time is to have that Black Knight down, play the Moon Knight on 3, discard one of your opponent's cards, discounting your stature, always hit your Agatha because that's how evens and odds work, and then play a 14 power cannot be destroyed Ebony Blade on turn 4. Anyway, basic premise here, one of your 3s sets up 14 to 18 power on turn 4. That's how the deck works, right? Then on turn 5, you want to play a Black Bolt. Once you have played this Black Bolt, you are then able to have a maximally powerful turn 6 of something like Claw or Legion alongside a Stature. Claw and Stature provide a lot of modality and a lot of customizability in terms of where you want your output. You can split them anywhere from across 3 lanes, putting 7, 4, and 8 into various lanes, to putting 15 into a lane and 4 into another, putting 11 into one lane, 8 into another. There's a lot of customizability here. Think of it almost as a Doctor Doom that you get to sort of pick and choose where you want to optimize the power output. Very powerful turn 6 play is Stature plus Claw. Stature plus Legion, a little less powerful in a general sense, but there are certain locations that make that one of the most powerful plays in the entire game. The deck is one of the few decks that I actually feel comfortable saying, like, here's what you want to do turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, turn 6. With most decks, that ends up being very modal, a thing that happens, not all of the time. You end up having to make contextual decisions. With this deck, it actually does play out like that. I think a lot of the reason I don't tend to do breakdowns like that is because I think they're inaccurate for almost every deck in Marvel Snap, except this one. If you're looking for an easy deck to play with a lot of power in it, this is a good choice right now. One of the things that I've really struggled with as a player recently is that I tend to be best with decks that can accept opposing snaps and then try to go over the top or interact with what my opponent is doing. I feel like recent metagames have been very heavy on they snap and you just sort of have to retreat depending on the matchups that you're looking at. If someone is Agatha snapping into you, you have a very good idea what they're going to do the rest of the game. And so now you have all of this ability to either retreat with nearly full knowledge or say, no, I'm going to be able to match you. I'm going to be able to beat you. I know what you're doing and I'll be able to beat it. The same applies to like Wiccan decks, for example. Very telegraphed, very straightforward. They're mostly doing the same things. And so I find a lot of value in a deck like this, which I'm calling Miki Mouse. It's just a deck that is looking to output maximal points in confusing and powerful and unexpected ways on the final turn of the game. One of the major things this deck gets to leverage is not just enormous points output, Gwenpool Mysterio, very, very strong, but points output coming from a deck that doesn't look like what it is. People aren't really expecting big Mysterios and Hitmonkeys out of a shell that is playing Angela and Kitty Pryde and things like that. People aren't expecting US Agents to drop out of a deck like this. What they're expecting is like a Wiccan deck on a bad draw. And so you get a lot of value out of that, and it is now something you have to be aware of when playing against this kind of stuff. The first few times I played against this, I was like, what's happening? How am I going to lose here? What are they doing? And the answer was by playing a lot of points after Gwen pulling a Mysterio and playing a Hitmonkey. Just a lot of numbers here. This is a very straightforward deck. All it is trying to do is numbers. You could make an analogy to call it maybe Bounceless Bounce. You could make an analogy to call it maybe No Key. The effective thing it's trying to do, though, is just have a bunch of good cards in a deck that is able to leverage those cards and play all of them, so you have all of the biggest cards possible at the cheapest costs possible. And then once you have that strategy lined up, you get to say, okay, well, I know what you're doing here. You're going to like Ghost Rider Agatha. Okay, you Ghost Ridered Agatha. My US Agent plays for 11 in that lane, hitting both Ghost Rider and Agatha. If you put a statue there, it plays for 15. If you put a claw there, it plays for 15. And so you end up being able to put a lot of pressure on opponents in ways that they are just totally unprepared to actually be able to deal with. Output range, very high, very confusing. You pick and choose lanes much like a bounce deck, and you output a very similar amount of points to that without having these sort of clunker draws of like, oh, it's turn 6 and I drew Falcon. Oh, it's turn 6 and I drew Beast. Or the weakness to Killmonger. Of all the decks that I've ever put together, the Drink is not the one that I expected to sort of settle in as like a sort of default expectation for what this kind of deck looks like right now. But it seems to have actually settled in, with this deck having a lot of specific play at the top end of High Infinite, like this exact 12. And so you do see a decent amount of people who are just trying to not necessarily fully scam you out of the game, but like half scam you and then half do something else to you. A lot of what this deck is built around is combining 3 different very powerful plays and trying to pull off 2 of those 3 in every game. Those plays are some combination of 2 clogs on a lane with 2 units in it to instantly win that lane, having a powerful play with like a dagger that goes up to 24, a vulture that goes up to 21 or something like that. Like big number cards tend to be like the second thing. And then the third thing that this deck does is just play Cannonball without having priority. That's the other thing it does very, very well. And it is very reasonably able to put a lot of power on the board and clog you up and play Cannonball. And so typically if 2 of those three things happen, like if they're able to pull off like, you know, a giant dagger and then a cannonball in another lane, you're probably going to lose the game. If they're able to pull off a full clog and then a giant dagger, you're probably losing the game. A full clog and then a cannonball, you're probably losing the game. And these packages actually just kind of go together. Like, oh no, I missed on my clog, better move it out of that lane. Now that, because I missed on my clog, that means that lane is full. I'm going to Madam Web my stuff either into or out of that lane to guarantee a win. You end up with a lot of really, really clever and interesting plays that this deck has available to it. And honestly, like, with Aranya coming out, I don't know if it goes in here. I don't know if whatever happens with that deck, but this is a powerful semi-clog, semi-move archetype fusing 2 archetypes that maybe can't make it on their own, but together, they can do anything. There's still a lot of trying to figure out the best way to leverage War Machine Legion type stuff. What I have seen as successful against me was decks that looked like this, leveraging a lot of early power with a Marvel Boy, allows you to be a functional Storm deck even when you don't have all the broken stuff, which is very important for a deck like this. Being a War Machine deck lets you be a bit of an Infinite deck. Having Hope Summers lets you have an alternate line into She-Hulk plus Infinite on the final turn of the game. You end up with a lot of different things that this can do. A lot of games can take different routes. You have games that are just like, I storm a lane and then I play a War Machine and then I win that lane on turn 5, and then on turn 6 I play an Infinite, and that's just big enough to win another lane. You have games that involve the full combo, Storm, War Machine, and Legion. You have games where you storm a lane and win it with 1-drops, and then you use the rest of your time trying to win another lane. You have games where you hope summers into the Infinite plus a She-Hulk. A lot of stuff can happen in this deck, and I think that's why I like this build more than I like many of the other ones, because it has a backup plan for its backup plan for its backup plan for its backup plan, and it feels like a much more thought out, a much more put together version of what other decks were trying to do. It remains to be seen exactly what kind of shelf life this has, and how long it has as a deck that functions, and how much of a predator it actually has to be before people just start running their own legions and war machines, which people are doing. Like, all the Agatha decks have legions, which is a huge problem for you. Like, it's a little bit awkward right now to be a deck using a card that is a combo like this as your, like, plan A. So a lot of the time when this happens, it's like, it's not actually really your plan A. Your actual plan A is just like numbers. I'd like some big She-Naut gameplay, right? And that can win, but it's not like a sort of a strategy with a proven pedigree, you know? Like, this is not the kind of thing that was winning before this combo came out. So to some degree, you are leaning on the combo here. But there is a lot of genuinely, I think, intelligent deck building that went into the archetype developing in this direction, and I'm excited to see what it can do in the future. We are still early in the metagame, and the metagame is honestly still kind of focused on points output. And that means that Zoo is just a phenomenal choice across the board. You get to just play a lot of points, and unless Shauna really screws you over, you're gonna be able to, like, output points in a way that beats up most of the things we've talked about so far. Downside of Zoo is whenever I've played it, Shauna really has screwed me over. And there's this little bit of awkwardness in the deck where it's like you kind of need to actually be curving out perfectly if you want to guarantee that you have the points you need to beat something like Agatha. Because that deck, you know, it has a lot of points in it. It's not a slouch points-wise, right? And so you need, 100% need, to go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Gilgamesh plus a 1. That's what you have to do if you want to be like, I'm winning this game for sure. And the rest of the time, like, if you miss one of those, or if your Shauna screws you over, you can end up in really awkward situations. If your stuff gets pitched by Black Bolt, you can end up in really awkward situations. Like, it's not a bad deck. I would go so far as to say it's an actively good deck, but it is a deck that feels like, honest to God, if Shauna was just Big Squirrel Girl, it would just be a better deck by so much. And so you end up with a deck that needs to curve out and needs to get points on the board and needs to put this output out first so it can go Khazar, Blue Marvel, Gilgamesh, right? Like, and once you do that, you're going to be very good into a lot of stuff. Your backup plan is usually like Khazar, Blue Marvel into, you know, Mockingbird, Shadow King if they have a good Shadow King target, stuff like that. The ability to run Shadow King is a luxury right now. You don't necessarily need to do it, but I think you have the choice between basically Shadow King and Kyera. I have opted for Shadow King. I think it is more relevant right now because there isn't the world's largest amount of Killmonger, but that is the kind of thing that can change in the blink of an eye. Bounce remains a compelling archetype with multiple different ways of building it. The one that has been the most successful for me has been this one that is looking to be a Shang SK Bounce deck. The idea here is just, I like having numbers on my end and interaction on theirs. People are still just fully disregarding the existence of Shang-Chi, which makes me want to be a Shang-Chi gamer a lot more than I otherwise would have been. And so having a Shang in your arsenal is just a powerful, strong thing to do, although it does cost 4. There are multiple ways to approach this kind of deck building as well. You could very easily put an Ajax package in here if you wanted even more points. Ajax has always been able to be hybridized into Bounce, and typically is best used alongside cards like Shang-Chi. I have no objections to making that decision as well. I won't be showing a deck list for that, but it's a fairly simple swap-in of Ajax and Hazmat if you're interested in taking the deck that direction, and I can see very little reason why you wouldn't at least consider it. Bounce deck number 2 is Wiccan Bounce, taking a bit of a different approach to the current metagame. The idea here is just saying, like, look, I want numbers. I want only numbers. Interaction, forget that. I am going to try to beat Agatha decks. I'm going to try to beat Zoo decks on numbers. I'm going to have the most numbers of all time. I'm going to curve out into a Wiccan, which is going to enable me to have even more numbers of all time. You'll notice that we're no longer running a Sasquatch in this deck, and a lot of that to me is because of the lack of Sandman. Sandman got kind of obliterated. We don't need to have that 10 in our deck because of Sandman anymore. But there is something to the idea of, like, if you're still seeing a lot of normal Wiccan decks, you can get that Sasquatch back in here because that was the other thing that Sasquatch is really good against. Now, you will have noticed we haven't talked about any Wiccan decks yet. We're going to get to that in a bit. I do think that they need to make some adjustments in order to keep up with the current metagame, because when you look at the amount of points, like, especially the Agatha deck puts out, you just have a bad matchup to that as a Wiccan deck. There's really not another way to say that. And so with Sandman dead, and Alioth decks having a new, genuinely bad matchup, we have opted in this list to sort of go against that type of deck building. We're not hedging for that anymore. We're just saying, give me the numbers. I need the numbers. Numbers me needing a lot now. And similarly, Techless Bounce, the deck cooked up by Husky and Woody, a very solid alternative for those who are looking to use their Symbiote Spider-Man in their Bounce deck. I personally prefer the Wiccan one. It seems to be operating on a level that I like a little bit more, but you are really able to just go crazy with Symbiote Spider-Man numbers here. You copy a Sage, you copy a Hitmonkey, we're talking enormous. I've had a 30 burger dropped on me in a lane with just SSM and a final turn Hitmonkey kind of deal. Like, that's some real stuff. But you also have to plan it out a lot. It's kind of difficult to actually get going, and I think on the whole, it's probably easier to play either of the other bounce decks we've talked about, and or make the swaps from the first bounce deck we talked about in order to get roughly similar output with a lot less effort. I'm not saying it's the worst decision in the world to play a deck like this, but I am saying that of the bounce decks, it's probably the one that is the most finicky. Let's talk a little bit about Wiccan. Now, I personally have felt that the major upside that old Wiccan decks had has been kind of hurt massively by the existence of Agatha Harkness in the metagame. This is a deck that needed to have exactly enough points to be ahead and play Alioth, first of all, and then also to generally win games with the amount of points it had in the deck. Right now, it feels like we're going a lot further closer towards a big, dumb stats metagame. And Agatha is sort of the thing pushing us in that direction. It's hard to ignore. This is like the most played, most successful deck at the top end of Infinite, and it beats the crap out of you. Now, why does it beat the crap out of you? Because their turn 4 is 14 to 18 power, and then their turn 5 is, 7. That's not great, but it's not bad. And then their turn 6 is like 19 or 20. And so you end up in a situation where they are mostly gonna be ahead of you. And that means that your Alioth isn't doing anything, and it means that in order for you to even come close to matching them on points, you need to play both of the 6 drops and a bunch of other good stuff. It just generally means that they're very consistent output because they always have Agatha in hand. They're like 90% to have one of the 3 drops that gets her out in hand. One of them might even discard your Wiccan, and so you end up in a spot where you just can't match that deck on numbers. You also find it hard to deal with decks like the Drink, because it just runs into you don't have interactive tools. This deck struggles a lot with getting a Shang-Chi into it because it needs to curve out. And since you don't have interactive tools, you get clogged very easily. You are also the kind of deck that can just be vulnerable to the biggest dagger of all time. And then you end up with like a deck that just you have an Alioth for the cannonball, but like they probably be able to win the game even if you do that a lot of the time. You just end up in matchups that are not fun or good for you. And so this list is built for 2 things. It's built for consistency, it's built for numbers. And I think that's how this deck has to build itself, but I don't really have a ton of faith in it. It's not like it's bad, but it went from a deck that was just like, I am consistently good into a bunch of stuff. I am the deck that is defining what we can and can't do in this metagame, to a deck that like actually kind of runs into some bad matchups, and they are really bad matchups. Like, when you are a points deck that gets outpointed, those matchups feel wholly unwinnable. They don't feel close. You just look at that and you're just like, yeah, I can never, ever win. And I maybe there's like a degree of sentimentality here, but I do feel like Wiccan took a step back. When it comes to trying to cook with Wiccan, this is what I was trying to do. I'm not sure it's held up, honestly. Like, I've been able to be fairly successful with it. I'm still above 50% on the season with it, but the stats on Untapped on this deck do not look good. And I don't want to be so arrogant as to say, like, oh, it's just like a really hard deck to play. People just don't get it. I think, like, fundamentally that represents that this is sort of a Wiccan identity crisis moment, because what I'm trying to do may just not be possible. I'm trying to get a Shang-Chi in there so that we don't infinitely lose the Agatha matchup, because I'd like to blow up Agatha Harkness. And it's just hard to make the deck work when you try to do that. I've tried leaning further into it. I've tried leaning less into it. I don't know who's going to solve this. Maybe the solve is as simple as taking that other deck and literally just playing Shang-Chi and Chang. Screw it. I just don't know. But I do have some worries for the future of Wiccan as an archetype if it can't keep up on points. I talked about this with the Mickey Mouse deck, but one of the things you're going to see a lot of here is a lot of decks that are rejoicing in the downturn in Wiccan and the obliteration of Sandman. This is one of those decks that was just like absolutely hammered by the Alliance out of Wiccan and the Sandman out of Sandman decks. And now it might actually be like a legitimately good playable option. This is a Sera deck that is focused entirely on numbers. It has the same sort of theory behind it as the Mickey Mouse deck, where you're really just trying to do the most numbers possible in the most unpredictable way possible. Boom, 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 boom. I'm playing big numbers. I'm playing big stats. I'm getting enormous unexpected value out of it because all of my cards that have a bunch of numbers on them are really cheap, and then Sera makes them cheaper, and sometimes Phastos makes them cheaper. And no, I don't think Phastos is even close to required for this. Not even in the slightest. It's just like a pretty reasonable and okay card here to obfuscate your output. And output really is the name of the game here. You want to have an output that people find confusing, because you're not playing tech cards in Sera. They're going to be playing around that. And you want to have an output that is massive, and Phastos and Sera really help with that. And you want to have an output that is unexpected, because you are going to be able to put it wherever you need that number to go. So that is the goal of this deck. Output a lot of numbers, do it in a confusing way, and increase the possible range of options so that your opponent has no real read on what you are going to do. Silver Surfer remains perfectly functional, perfectly good, absolutely fine deck. I have absolutely no bad things to say about Silver Surfer, and I frankly probably never will. One of the things about Marvel Snap that I think people really get on is like, Cam, there's just no decks that I feel like I can invest in and constantly play and like feel rewarded for that. Silver Surfer is never bad. It's just never, ever, 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 ever bad. You are probably going to be fine doing what the hell ever whenever you play this deck, because there are so many threes that you can use to customize it to whatever it is that you want to do. You can make a Silver Surfer deck that is customized to whatever metagame. I genuinely love Silver Surfer, and I realize people are going to look at this and be like, oh, Copycat, that's expensive. Nocturne, that's expensive. You don't need Copycat. You might not even need Nocturne. Just play threes. This is a list that a lot of my top player friends have been raving about recently. I will say I'm putting it on here on their recommendation. I had an internet issue that knocked me out yesterday, and that was sort of when they discovered this. So this is a pure recommendation based on other top high infinite gamers. The idea here is just straight up mid-range. This is just a mid-range deck. You're doing numbers, you're doing interaction in the form of clogging them, but mostly you're just doing numbers. There's some like small package Ghost Spider, Madam Web type stuff that I really like here. I sort of look at this as like an alt build of the drink, personally. Partially because I want to take credit for it, but mostly because it's trying to do similar things, right? Like it's the same kind of deck where it's like you're trying to get a lot out of Madam Web, you're trying to get a lot out of confusing your opponent, you're trying to get a lot out of, interacting with your opponent, not necessarily directly, but through clogging them, and that is a sort of time-honored, time-tested thing to do. I do feel like it's worth including here. Speaking of Madam Web, I think it's become very clear that the builds with Tribunal and the builds with Taskmaster are not good, and if you want to be playing Madam Web, the fact is that you kind of need to be playing it like a traditional move deck right now, which is kind of a coup for Second Dinner when you think about it. But basically, the Taskmaster nerf did what it needed to make sure that the force multipliers that would have been available to this deck were not available to it. I do feel fairly confident that if Taskmaster was still 5 cost, this deck would be very broken because it's already strong as is, and it's forced to be a Heimdall deck. And that's kind of ridiculous because it does not want to be a Heimdall deck. It cries out for a Taskmaster in it, honestly, but it can't be because Taskmaster costs 6, and Living Tribunal costs 6, and those sacrifices you have to make are just not worth making. So you end up having to be a fundamentally more easy to interact with deck. I personally think that this is the best version of the move deck if you are going to play pure move. You have your Cosmo in here in order to prevent interaction, because instead of preventing interaction by fully bouncing all your stuff, like you would want to do with a Taskmaster build of this deck, if it costs 5 still, you now have to prevent interaction face up on the board because Heimdall requires you to have your stuff face up on the board, which makes it much more easy for decks packing Shang-Chi and Shadow King to really get you, hence the need for the Cosmo. There's been a lot of noise about new cards in Phoenix Force. Frankly, I think this Phoenix Force build is still perfectly acceptable, perfectly good. I have not seen anything to suggest that I need to have Madam Web in here or that I benefit from having Madam Web in here. You just do the same things you've always done. You make big Phoenix Forces, you make big Nimrods, you put a lot of power on all the locations, and you just be bigger than other things. The interesting thing here, though, is with the way the metagame is going, you still are going to be bigger than a lot of stuff, but there are decks that might actually just be able to be like, oh, okay, so your max power here would be 32 if there were no other units there with only Phoenix Forces there on the multiple men. Okay, that's cool. I can beat that. But you also have a 2 power thing here, so your max power here is actually 26. If your max power here is 26 and your max power here is 26, I can beat 26 here. And like there are more decks that are able to actually say that now. I'm not saying it's going to happen all the time, but your combo is only a combo as long as it actually wins those lanes, right? Like Phoenix Force has always been the sort of smallest and easiest to access of the combo decks. And like, you do kind of run into like some, oh man, I'm not really sure if I'm actually outpointing them here. Like, you also have these other games, which are good, where you have like a Venom on the board, you like Shuri and Nimrod, then you Zola the Venom. That stuff is also the kind of thing that they can just kind of math out. Like, okay, they Zola the Venom goes here, the Venom goes here, this is how many points they're going to have. It's not always beatable. Like, a lot of the time, that is going to still be unbeatable, and they are still going to leave. But there are more decks right now that are able to do something about that, and that is something to consider. I'm not saying that this makes the deck bad by any means, but it was, I would say, especially in the height of the Wiccan meta, where everything that was able to do that was being punished by Sandman and Goliath, it was very easily able to be like, yeah, I'm going to win. Now that those cards aren't here, there are more decks that can reasonably try to just beat you on numbers. I've been seeing some good things about JaneJaw recently. I have always kind of been a fan of JaneJaw. I'm glad to see people being able to do something with this archetype again. The major things that I'm not really sure about what they're doing are the 2 slot here. Like, I get it. I'm not positive on the Madam Web. The Madam Web might be too high roll. The Madam Web might be the perfect thing for this deck to split its power across multiple locations after a Lockjaw. Being able to play a Lockjaw into a Madam Web lane is genuinely amazing. The fact that Kate Bishop gives you extra things to chuck in the Lockjaw lane, also amazing. The Thor plan is quite strong. You have a Killmonger in order to interact with people, which I do like. And I think a lot of what this deck is trying to do is just like say, hey, look, you guys are all competing on numbers. I can compete on numbers too. And being able to do that is really, really cool. One thing I am interested in is trying out to see if I can fit an Odin in here. I don't think that I can, and I'm not sure it's going to be good, but I do know from playing against it that the threat of an Odin really does loom kind of large because of the ways in which it can multiply a Beta Ray Bill or a Thor proc. I'm not saying that's the kind of thing that has to happen, but it is something that comes to mind as something that has some real potential. I'm interested to see the direction this deck goes in the future. Destroy is the same deck it's always been. It is able to meaningfully interact with decks playing 1s thanks to thanks to the inclusion of the card Killmonger. It is still a deck that needs to high roll if it wants to be able to match these points decks on points, but it can absolutely do that. having good draws, Deadpool into Hulkbuster and to start blowing that guy up all the time, having X-23s in order to get that extra energy so you can Deadpool null on the final turn. There's less Alioths in the metagame. You are going to be able to just like face down billion points, and that's a really strong thing to be able to do right now. I've seen less Mobius in the metagame. Your death is going to be less hurt. This is a reasonably better metagame for this deck than the previous one was. I don't know exactly how far up the tier list that is able to move it, but if you are a Destroy Bro, and I know there are plenty of you out there, not a bad time. I've been looking for other mid-range cores that I can just run Shang-Chi in. I did try this deck out. I wasn't overly impressed with it, but that's to say, like, I didn't, like, monster climb with it. It was, like, a deck I went, like, I want to say like 9 and 5 with to gain like a couple cubes. It was fine. I have no issues with it. And I think that if you're looking for something that like you just happen to have all these cards and you want to just try playing a new mid-range deck, it's not like the worst thing in the world to try to play a deck like this. It's totally acceptable. I'm not sure it ever has real room to grow though. This feels like the kind of deck where it's just like, this is about as good as it's ever gonna be. It's like exactly at par for a deck that can get onto the video right now. And I find it hard to believe there's like room for it to go much higher here. The answer to the question of can we get much higher? I don't think so. I made fun of the idea that Arrow would replace Mockingbird in the Tens archetype. It kind of has. Like, I don't think this deck is nearly as good as it was. It does still have some juice, but it's not like the most juicy the way that it was previously. Being able to go Mockingbird after a Mysterio on 3 into 10 on 4, 10 on 5 free Scar was the thing this deck was best at. Now it's like, okay, you can like, we don't really have access to any of that stuff anymore. Because we're not playing Mockingbird, our Sasquatch is worse. It's hard to build this deck right now. That's fundamentally where I'm at. There have been multiple attempts at it. None of them have been perfectly sold to me. So I'm going to put this deck on here as a placeholder for I think there's some real potential here if people are willing to do the digging into making this deck actually work right now. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.